Here to pick up a serum order for a Dr. Connors?
I mean, for me, I think it's very interesting to work on an existing IP, especially one as deep and beloved as Spider-Man. And what's really great about Insomniac is that there's obviously a lot of Spider-Man fans at the company too. So we're all coming at this, as in terms of being fans as well. And then you're absolutely right. We work very closely with Marvel Games to really understand the character of Spider-Man as well, because throughout history, his story has been retold so many times through animation, and film and comics. And how do you keep, telling that same story over and over again, but do it in a refreshing way? And it really does come down to just remembering, who Spider-Man is. He is the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The best Spider-Man stories are when Spider-Man's worlds collides with Peter's and Miles Morales's. So we always make sure that we never forget the human under the superhuman. Yeah. So we always want to make sure that we tell that human story. And then the superhero story just kind of rides on top. And I think as long as we keep that essence, of Spider-Man forever, no matter what kind of game we're making, as long as it's a Spider-Man game, then we'll always be true to the franchise and that universe. So for us, it's really refreshing to be able to build on what people have done before, but then also put our own spin on it.
What is that?
Probably a static discharge. Means the accelerator's working. Clever freaking.
I think for us, we have relentless editing too, because obviously we have a very strong, narrative team. And we work very closely with gameplay, creative direction, art direction, just to make sure that the story is right. So, we'll write a story and maybe this will come out years later, but, we'll change the ending. The first game, I feel like we changed the ending so many times because we were like, oh, it feels right. And then maybe in a few months, it doesn't feel right. And I would say the same thing for this game as well. I mean, we've wrote the story and then rewrote and constantly we're editing it until it felt right. And like I was saying before, we kept, the essence of the Spider-Man character in it, So there's a lot of people looking at it. And then Marvel Games, obviously they also provide a lot of help because they're very familiar with the character, of course. So they always are able to offer some guidance as well.
I don't know. I was just so in the chute. You okay?
Think so. I'm going to the breaker room. I can do the next one there.
I mean, this might be slightly spoilery if I tell you about the inner workings of Insomniac. Oh no, I'm willing to say. But it's interesting because when we're working on the first game, we'll talk about it and then we end it and then we're always saying, oh, but then in another game we could do this, or maybe if we did this, this will happen in the sequel. So even though we're really focused on the current project, we're always thinking about the next thing and how to tie it all together.
You have hunted me. This is good.
So, I mean, I think the great thing about working on a sequel is that we can look at what we've already done really well. So, something like swinging, like everybody loves swinging. So that's not something we want to reinvent or throw out. No, but at the same time, because we're working on a sequel, we want to offer something new to the players. And that's why we're able to, offer the web wings, which obviously they exist in the comics too. So again, we're able to, start from the comics. But just adding the web wings to me adds like a whole layer of traversal to the game as, and another layer to how you can move around. And it's so different to be able to glide over the city now and see the world from a different perspective, but then easily switch back to swinging if you really like it. And then, for something like combat, we added the parry mechanic, so that's another way to just update how we fight. So we kind of had a winning system, but we were able to add more to it. And then for something like stealth, we added the web line, which allows Spider-Man to create, his own webs. And then that way you don't have to rely on things like walls or perch points. It gives the player a lot more freedom. So it's really just about building upon our strengths and knowing what the strengths are and just adding new ways of doing those things that players know and love. I think the really nice thing about the Miles game is that it lets us introduce Miles Morales more, right? Because he was obviously introduced in the first game, but then in the Miles Morales game, we can just focus on him and really build out his story so that we can prepare him for Spider-Man 2. So we don't have to spend so much time doing the character development and explaining him. And what's really nice about it too is that there's a lot of fans of Miles Morales. So I think when they play Spider-Man 2, it's like seeing an old friend again. They're very happy to see him. And it was wonderful to be able to integrate the two Spider-Men into one game so that you can play as both. So in terms of making Spider-Man 2 and how that works in the story, I mean, if you play the Spider-Man 2 now, there is actually a recap at the beginning that gives you a nice summary about, you know, what happened before. And we try to, I mean, you probably see it in just kind of how we do the pacing, because at the beginning of the game, we really start with, you know, it's a day in the life of this Spider-Man, right? It's Miles Morales in high school. He's, you know, Brooklyn Vision's Academy. And then Peter Parker is the substitute teacher. And by the end of that first mission, all the stuff already happens in their lives where, you know, Miles is trying to figure out what he wants to do next. And I think it's very relatable, and we do it in a very, how do you say it, a very succinct way, you know, where, you know, he's trying to type his college essay. He's trying to get in college. His friends all know what they want to do, but he doesn't know what he wants to do. And that's done like very quickly at the beginning of the game. And I think that is so relatable that even if you don't know the backstory of Miles, you immediately can understand where he is. And then slowly we will then remind players that his father did die at the hands of Mr. Negative. And then that's kind of the other looming conflict that he has. And I think that's very easy to understand, even if you haven't played the previous games.
Deadly nonetheless. Find them. Kill them.
Craven. How many more people are on this guy?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think Spider-Man fans are so devoted, and you're right. Depending on maybe what year you were born, it kind of dictates if you're like a fan of the comic books or a fan of certain movies. But, you know, for us, I think we have to understand what everyone else has done before us. And also, you know, at the same time as us, for example, you know, what Sony Pictures is doing with Spider-Verse. But in the end of the day, we have to make something that we're happy with as fans, and that makes us, you know, that we're proud of. But then also stay true to Spider-Man. So I just think like we are aware of what everyone does, but we don't want to really cross over into what everyone has done. So we have to kind of forge our own path, you know? So in a way you're aware of it, but you kind of have to ignore it too. Because I think if you try to please everyone too much, you're not going to end up with a good game, you know? So we have to kind of like insulate ourselves a little.
Sure. A brilliant scientist! You made some mistakes, but it doesn't have to end like this!
You know, what's interesting to me about again, Spider-Man is that he's such a relatable character. The biggest thing for me between Peter and Miles is that they're actually just in different points in their life. You know, we talked a lot about Miles and how, you know, he's in high school trying to figure out what he wants to do for college. Like, what does he want to do with his life? Because it's just beginning, right? And he's also dealing with the death of his father and his mom potentially dating again, which is really traumatic. Those are all things I think like any young person or even someone who's not in high school anymore can relate to. But then Peter's problems are, it's always the same thing with us because we like to torture him. But, you know, he's struggling with what he wants to do as well. And now he's living in Aunt May's house. He's underwater on the mortgage because Aunt May had mortgaged the house to try to keep Feast afloat from the first game. But Peter doesn't make a lot of money, but he doesn't want to let that house go. So he also has to figure out, gosh, how is he going to make money? What does he want to do with his life? What is his career going to be? And how does he balance that with Spider-Man? And I just think that those types of themes are very universal. It doesn't matter where you're from or, you know, like where you live. I think those are so relatable that it's very universal. Everybody can understand it immediately, you know? So I think as long as we keep those themes that are relatable in the story, then I'm not so worried about, you know, how do we tell the story and make it fresh. Like I said, it ties a lot back to, like those universally relatable themes. But I think what's interesting about Spider-Man 2 is the introduction of the symbiote too. Because the symbiote is often an allegory, in the comics for your inner darkness. And to me, it's so interesting in Spider-Man 2, how it changes the characters that run into the symbiote and how it pulls that darkness out from them and how they deal with it. And Miles, for example, like he kind of has a darkness too because he's struggling with what to do with Mr. Negative, who, and she's shown this in all the trailers, so this isn't a spoiler. But he's obviously he's escaped from Raft. So, as a son, his father's killer is out on the loose, and like he's in a position to do something about it because he's a superhero and he has these powers. And then with like Peter, he's dealing with this symbiote. And again, you've seen it in the trailers where, he says some pretty nasty things to his friends, and they all are noticing that he's not right. So I think that's another thing that we've introduced in Spider-Man 2 is just taking all these characters that people like know and love, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but giving them this bit of darkness. And how do they now deal with that, but still stay true to themselves?
So you like smashing things?
Yeah, I was the first time I saw some of those lines being delivered when Peter starts acting off. I was telling Yuri Lowenthal, the voice actor, I said, "Oh my gosh, you're so bad. You're so good at being bad." And he was telling me that it was really hard for him to be dark, so afterwards, he'd have to take a walk and take a break because he said it was really, really tough. But you're right. And the nice thing about the medium of video games is that like we do put that controller in players' hands. So if they're a Peter and maybe he's not himself and he has to do something that's not, right, like that's in the control of the player. So same thing with Miles, So I think that's what's interesting about video games and how we're able to tell the story in a really visceral way.
You have hunted me. This is good. Let's see if you have the strength to finish what you started.